and welcome to Varn Blog. I'm here with Elijah Emery, and we're doing a special. The reason why it's a special is anything I record that touches on any specifics of Donald J. Trump, the current president of the United States, or Doge base, or whatever the fuck weird cabinet position that's not a cabinet position that exists today is. It's going to be out of date in a month, so maybe even sooner than that. And I want to start this out saying, A, I know this is dangerously close to punditry, and we don't like to do that here, but we are going to talk about the constitutionality of at least three Trump major movements. Two, I want to do a mea culpa in that I said that Project 2025 was so incoherent that it was unlikely that anyone would actually take on most of it. While there are large elements of Project 2025 that no one seems to be really willing to do, like trying to return us to the gold standard, there's a lot more of it being done than I initially thought. And three, there's stuff that's being suggested or done that no one saw, wasn't even in Project 2025, and is just as weird. Although four, this leads me to the fact that I think no matter how this plays out, and Elijah may disagree with me on this, we're going to be in a political crisis because the Democrats and the Republicans and the, quote, deep state or the administrative state apparatus, despite knowing that all this was possible for up to 2 years, seem to be completely flat-footed, even though it is doing the thing that we were told would be done, which is a blitz.
I'm going to say on the record that I agree with that. And that I do not disagree with that at all. So we were talking, thank you for having me. I'm Elijah. In case listeners don't remember me, I came on back in the day to talk about Lash mostly. I've since gone to law school and am a law student, which gives me no qualification. And yet here I am.
Does anyone have any qualification for what's happening right now, since so much of it's never happened before?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and certainly I'm more qualified, I think, to talk about these things than the 19 and 20-year-old staffers Elon has hired to fire everyone in the federal government. So I think me and Varn were talking off air that there's really three central issues which we want to touch on, or which I want to touch on. The first being the Trump executive order purporting to eliminate birthright citizenship. The second being the impoundment crisis, whereby the Trump administration has refused to utilize duly allocated funds appropriated by Congress and provide them to the programs that have been outlined by Congress. And the last is the host of firings of civil officials, perhaps most notably one of the NLRB representatives, which seems to go against current constitutional protections for individuals within the administrative state. So
go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I mean, to me, birthright citizenship is easy. It's an amendment. It's clear as day what the amendment means. It can be reversed, but it would require an amendment.
Yeah, and then it's also backed by Wong Kim Ark and other Supreme Court presidents. One thing which I think is useful to outline here, and this is very simple, is that at the time of the passage of the 14th Amendment, there were three groups who were exempted from birthright citizenship, two of which are still exempted and one of which no longer is. The first was members of Native American nations who were not under the jurisdiction at the time of the 14th Amendment of the federal government. They now are. So if you're born on a Native American reservation, you're a citizen. The second are the children of diplomatic officials. And they remain exempt from American jurisdiction. So their children are not birthright citizens. if both of the parents are diplomatic officials with diplomatic immunity. And then finally, and this hasn't been tested, children born to members of an invading army on U.S. soil, which also has not been tested but remains on the books. And I think one thing which I will stress about this for any listeners who are under the impression that illegal immigrants are not subject to American jurisdiction, they very much are. If an illegal immigrant commits a crime, they will be tried in the American court system or have the ability to be tried in the American court system. And that's what jurisdiction means. And then also, I think what's worth emphasizing is that the amendment relates not to the parents, but to the children. What matters is, it's not a question of the rights of the parents to have their child be an American citizen. It's a question of the right of whatever child is born under American jurisdiction on American soil to have citizenship rights under the federal Constitution. So this, I think, is the most blatantly unconstitutional order pursued so far by the Trump administration.
And although, ironically, it's also the thing that Trump has pursued before, whereas the other things that we're talking about are new.
Yeah.
Well, not entirely new. There was a little bit of attempts at impoundment at the end of the last Trump administration, and he got told no by the courts. Although right now we see J.D. Vance seemingly wanting to start a constitutional crisis, saying that the courts can't tell the president no about what is a legitimate authority. And my, quote, leftist, unquote, friends tell me that a legitimate authority is decided by, quote, the people, unquote, which I reminded them that technically then that is the legislature, because the legislature is the legal voice of the people.
What I will say about that, to add to that, is that the representative of the people in the American context under Republican with a small r theories is the Constitution, because it was directly ratified by the American people when it was first written in the 1780s. And then subsequent amendment is also representative of the people, and more representative of the people than any immediately elected president or immediately elected legislature. And under that constitutional order, appropriations are given to the Congress. All bills of revenue, all tax and spending bills must originate in the House of Representatives, which was originally understood to be the most democratic body within the federal government. And you're completely right that the people are supreme under the theory of the American system, and this may be distinct from practice, but under that theory, their first articulation of their power, of their sovereignty, is the Constitution itself. And then their second are their elected representatives. And in this case, the Constitution is very clear that taxing and spending authority comes from the legislature and not from the executive.
Right. You can make the case, I think, that also that at least the framers, and we can talk about how much that does or does not matter, particularly now, thought that the legislature, even though it was only one of the branches of government and had checks and balances against it, in a quasi aristocratic way, even, that specifically the executive, just like in Europe in the parliamentary system, was originally thought of as an extension of the legislature, since it was elected indirectly, and had to deal with all kinds of fun stuff. And that has been addressed by either constitutional amendment and or local rule changes to elections, because in the United States, while we're going to talk about the Constitution a lot today, I want people to know I know it's in the Constitution, so it means I'm not dumb enough to be a constitutional absolutist. So don't come at me about that. There's some of this stuff that I'm telling you because I want you guys to understand what the laws are, not because I necessarily believe that this is the best way to run a system. but that the executive, for example, in the parliamentary system, its existence was a historical accident. Walpole wasn't even like, he's the first prime minister, but there is no like formal constitutional provision in England, which also doesn't really have a formal constitution.
There's no written constitution in England, as you're saying. Yeah,
right. The constitution is in England is traditional. Maybe it's hard to say exactly what it would be. We don't have an equivalent to it in U.S. law, but it doesn't really exist. Is my point. And
what of it exists does establish that the executive has no independent spending and taxing authority.
Right.
Even under English law, one of the big issues for the kings, who were very much sovereign and still may theoretically be under English law, is that they did not have the authority to originate taxes that came from Parliament. And that is an understanding of the role of the legislature, which continued into the American Republic and continues today in the American context.
So looking at what's called the traditional, the abstract people, when we talk about the Constitution, the reason why we can clearly say that the legitimacy on this issue on birthright citizenship is legislative or state-based, which means it requires either, what is it, like 70% of the legislature roughly to agree to amend the Constitution, or what, 2/3 of the states.
Yeah, yeah. The Article 5 amendment process, I want to make sure the numbers are correct, is that there's a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, or a 2/3 convention, a 2/3 of the states calling for a convention, and then 3/4 of state legislatures or state conventions must support the amendment in order to make it part of the law. So it's an extremely high barrier, which is one reason why executive fiat is insufficient to overturn the constitutional structure.
Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, which no one should like, but I actually know neo-Confederate arguments well enough to tell you the argument against this. Is that the 13th and 14th, now, and I'm also going to say Trump has not made this argument before people come at me. But the 13th and 14th Amendment in particular, as the Civil War Amendment, since the Southern states were not sitting, are invalid because they were passed at a time when the Southern states could not vote. Now, they're not going to mention the fact that they couldn't vote because they had tried to leave the Union and were under Reconstruction governments. But that is the neo-Confederate argument for getting rid of the 13th and 14th Amendment. Now, I will also say getting rid of the 13th and 14th Amendment has a lot more ramifications than you even think. It would remove the Bill of Rights applicability to state law. For those of you who don't know, it's the 13th and 14th Amendment that means that the Bill of Rights actually applies to state governments. Before the Civil War, state governments could violate the Bill of Rights, and it was legal.
Yeah, though I will say that this was modified by the slaughterhouse cases in the late 1800s, which kind of ruled against incorporation on those lines. Incorporation meaning the incorporation of federal protections to state governments. And then we're gradually read back in using different readings of the 14th Amendment. So that's completely true. I just wanted to complicate the story a little bit so that listeners get the full picture.
Yeah, I should have mentioned the slaughterhouse cases because that's a Supreme Court ruling that is like clearly, I hate to say it, but like I know it's technically still good law.
Yeah, but it's precedentially, I think, totally invalid. Should be overturned.
But it's terrible because it literally, like, we undid the clear reading of the law, but also in a way that doesn't even make sense because it doesn't completely undo it. Because, for example, states, even after the slaughterhouse cases, couldn't restrict your freedom of speech, which they could actually before the Civil War. but yes, there's all kinds of modifications. And I will say, and this is something that you may or may not agree with me on, I will say we're learning some of the difficulties of over-relying on the courts to settle social questions, and of the legislature, which has been abnegating its own responsibility, not just now, which it also clearly is, but also basically has been doing that since World War II.
Yeah, I mean, I would complicate that a little bit, because I think that the legislature has at various times since World War II been more or less reliable in a category of fields. So, for example, I think that the Great Society legislature was very reliable in passing domestic policy, but was, it used to be, for example, that when the appropriations for the national security apparatus came up, it was Senate custom to turn the sheet of paper over so that they couldn't see what they were appropriating money for, and then vote in favor of it. And I think that's a clear abdication of their responsibilities too. These responsibilities, what of them remained for most of the post-World War II period, have clearly been less and less potent, where Congress doesn't work. It barely scrapes together an appropriations bill every year, and has generally proved unable or unwilling to make the type of large-scale reforms necessary for the maintenance of the republic, frankly, which and has also been more and more reliant on the executive to set policy.
Right. We can see from FDR to Reagan, and from Reagan to George W. Bush, and from George W. Bush to Trump 1. And I see these in broad swaths here, admittedly, but there is an increase of the use of executive orders, starting in World War II and amping up more and more until Nixon, and then amping up a ton under Reagan, and then amping up a ton again under George W. Bush, and then amping up even more, frankly, under Obama.
Yeah. I mean, DACA was an executive order, for example.
Right. And I made a very unpopular argument back in the day when DACA was on the thing, that I actually thought that DACA was the right policy, but that I thought that it was unconstitutional. So, and the Supreme Court kind of agreed with me, kind of. So DACA was sort of
it was upheld, but it was an equivalent policy for the parents was not upheld, and the Supreme Court instead basically asked the government to utilize prosecutorial discretion rather than the wholesale granting of green cards, essentially.
Right. One thing I will say is Obama's where prosecutorial discretion really became a bigger and bigger issue. Mm-hmm. And not just on DACA, also on federal weed laws, because for whatever reason, they didn't want to try to run a marijuana legalization through to get the states in line with the federal government. So instead, you've had this now Obama through Biden and through Trump. I mean, I don't see this changing, but
patchwork system whereby there's a reliance on the federal government abstaining from certain constitutional responsibilities it has, however unwise those responsibilities are,
right,
as a means of maintaining a status quo rather than changing the law when that's the most reasonable course of action.
So I just wanted to give this a context, because I don't think what we're talking about applies to the birthright citizenship. I agree with you. I think it's not just that the amendment is clear, stare decisis is clear, and quite frankly, I'm not usually willing to predict what Supreme Court justices are going to do, but the only two justices that I would predict that would even pretend to agree with Trump's argument on this would be, ironically, the two conservatives he didn't appoint, Alito and
Thomas,
who actively and proudly do not have a jurisprudential theory anymore. Thomas has given his up now that Scalia is dead and there's no more originalism. And Alito just actually flaunts the fact that he doesn't have a
I will say that
constitutional jurisprudence.
I believe it was Sotomayor, it might have been Kagan, who said we're all originalists now, where originalism dominates the understanding of the Constitution, but it doesn't result necessarily in just conservative policy if you do it correctly. For example, on birthright citizenship, an originalist understanding of the 14th Amendment could only be read to guarantee birthright citizenship to every person born under US jurisdiction within the United States. There's no originalist argument for Donald Trump's executive order.
No.
And I agree with you that I think it almost inconceivable for the court to rule in favor of it.
So let me expand upon the wackadoo theory that they may try to use to argue this. They're going to use war on terror level Patriot Act provisions to declare all immigrants from South America an invading army, and then try to use that provision to ban. Now, here's the issue. I still don't see how it would be permanent because you can't declare.
There's still under American jurisdiction. You can declare an invasion, but if it's not an occupying force, it doesn't matter. They could be invaders. I don't think they are, but they could be understood to be an invading force, but they're not an occupying force. And therefore, the exemptions to the 14th Amendment do not apply. So I'm agreeing with you. That's the theory they're going to use. And it's completely insane. And any person with any understanding of how the law works and any shred of decency would rule against that theory if it was advocated in a federal court.
Now, I'm not going to predict how willing the Supreme Court is to stand up to Donald Trump, but I will say that even before he went into office, he took 2 losses from the Supreme Court before he even was sitting this second administration. And interestingly enough, despite what liberals said, his own appointees are more likely to deviate than the other conservatives on his mess. Well, I shouldn't say not just his. I guess Gorsuch is not him, but Gorsuch
was him.
Okay. Yeah. Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett, and Kavanaugh, and to a lesser degree, Roberts. Roberts is easier to predict because you can say, is it going to cause a theory for his a problem for his theory of like conservative action being slow. But I do find it hilarious right now watching conservatives on Twitter picking JD Vance up and talking about judicial activists when they're talking about judges that the conservatives appointed.
I mean, the guy who struck down birthright citizenship was a Reagan appointee. You know, like these are not liberal people. Okay, these are not activist liberal judges.
No.
They're following their constitutional duty in the birthright citizenship case, and in impoundment and in firing to say this is illegal. In terms of impoundment, I think it is also unlikely that the Supreme Court would bless impoundment in the way it's currently being utilized. An example being that I just don't see it being constitutional under any theory to, for example, eliminate U.S. aid, which is, a congressionally established department, basically. And I imagine that when push comes to shove, the judiciary will rule in favor of maintaining it in some form. On the other hand, I don't know if they'll move fast enough to prevent the damage from being done. And this is, I think, the most important case for all of these firings that are happening. So the way current law works is the basic argument in favor of these firings falls under the Unitary executive theory, which for listeners is a theory that the Constitution, by virtue of the vesting clause of Article 2, which relates to the executive, vests all executive power in the position of the executive, and grants them broad latitude to conduct themselves basically as they see fit within the ambit of the executive department. This does not include impoundment, because this is a responsibility to execute the laws that Congress has passed. But taken to its logical conclusion, it would place very few limitations on firing executive officials. Under the current understanding of the Constitution, there are some constraints on firing. So the two basic precedents which govern protections for civil officials from being fired, good cause protections, are these decisions called Murphy and another decision called Humphrey's Executor. And what they establish is a situation whereby a purely political appointee can be fired at will. An appointee who is a member of a multi-member nonpartisan board, an example being the NLRB, should not be fired at will. Has to be fired for malfeasance of duty or corruption or things that would get one fired were they an ordinary employee, basically, in a non-at-will position. And then finally, for semi-legislative and semi-judicial appointees. So an example of this would be, for example, a chief administrative judge, possibly. There's the same protection where you are allowed to have protections for these employees to prevent them from being fired immediately. And something that the Trump administration is doing is seeking to pose a moment of judicial clash with these decisions with the hope of overturning them. And I think it's not unlikely that these decisions could be further cabined than they are, meaning the limitations on them could be made stronger. But under current law, it's very, very obvious that a whole host of these firings are completely unconstitutional. And it should be added to that the firing of ordinary civil service workers is also, for most of them, unconstitutional because they're employees. And as employees, they're considered to have the ability to have insulation from the political, the political firing, basically, so that they can carry out their jobs the same way an ordinary employee could.
Although, I'm agreeing with you here that I could easily see this being constitutionally reinterpreted away. Whereas the other two things, impoundment, because it has to do with the disbursement of funds as allocated by Congress, is clearly a violation of separative powers, something that conservatives used to give a shit about. And birthright citizenship is clearly a violation of a goddamn amendment.
But one of my favorite ones, personally, like two of the best things about the Constitution are strong freedom of speech protections and the fact that I think it's the Constitution has a host of problems, but it's great and we should keep it, that if you're born here under US law, you're a citizen and you get to help decide the future of this country. This is like one of the best things the American Republic ever did. So it really sucks that they're going after this rather than something stupid that's in the Constitution.
One of the things I think this leads us to, though, we've hinted at what my theory of what is happening. And some of my theory, I'm actually going to admit, sounds a little bit like Christopher Caldwell, the uber reactionary. But I want to spell it out. Because of the social conflicts in the legislature in the 1960s, we have in general seen, I'm going to say it has not been linearly so, but we have in general seen an acceleration of Congress abrogating its traditional powers to other parts of the government, either to the executive or to the administrative state directly, which puts us in a precarious situation, which means highly contentious social conflict, gay marriage, most of the Civil Rights Act, was thus moved from the legislature, where there was progress being made on these issues until the middle 60s, to the Supreme Court. And in general, liberals and even some leftists, I had a Marxist friend of mine in Germany make this argument, that the most progressive elements of the US state was the courts, which then has led liberals not really to worry that much until very recently about over relying on court precedent for establishing US law. Now, there are a lot of leftists who point out that this basically made this vision of constitutional review does mean that SCOTUS has near dictatorial powers over the law.
So long as the
that are not
executive and legislature listens to them.
Right. Which, unfortunately for us, the Democrats decided that precedent was worth, I don't know, having someone come in and undo all the precedent later, thus not really trying to do anything about the courts. Because they could have court packed legally. They could have passed reforms. I'm not sure the reforms would have passed unless they were constitutional, but which would require them to, get along with the GOP on something.
Well, I think a good example of this is the contrast between gay marriage and abortion. Both, as of 5 years ago, so no longer true, both gay marriage and abortion were guaranteed by the courts. And on the issue of gay marriage, after Roe v. Wade was overturned in the Dobbs decision, a bipartisan coalition passed a law maintaining gay marriage as a right in, a kind of a cabin form where it's more about the recognition of state marriage licenses by other states. But it's an example of a stronger statutory protection, which doubles up with a still existing Supreme Court precedent to show that you're not putting all of your eggs in one basket. Whereas with abortion, this was not a possibility, or was not a choice if it was a possibility, on the part of Congress. And as a result, abortion rights were eliminated in one fell swoop by a majority of the Supreme Court. And it's one reason why it's a bad idea to count on courts alone to guarantee constitutional or so-called constitutional rights when there's a debate over the extent of those rights.
Right. One thing we will see with abortion rights is that they still exist, which makes them sort of a catchy thing electorally, because they still exist in the places that really care about them for Democrats. And that was a Democratic advantage until this last go around. Thank you, inflation and Biden's general incompetence in the last year. But I want to spell out some of what this may mean. One thing that is happening very quickly, Elon Musk is becoming one of the most unpopular people on the planet incredibly quickly. He is way more unpopular than Trump. Part of me wonders if that's part of why Trump is letting this happen, so that the blame can go on Elon later. But that is pure punditry, and we should be careful about such things. I do not know the mind of Donald Trump, and I don't think anyone else does either.
Whenever he's signing these executive orders, he's signing an order to prosecute the Hamburglar and force Andrew Lloyd Webber to make a new musical. And then, wouldn't you know it, in his hand, these executive orders turn into an order for an invasion of Greenland. Who could say?
Point
being, he's an incomprehensible figure.
But we have seen, and I want to talk about the three reasons at play here. So one, this is the part that I agree with Christopher Codrell, but for almost the opposite reason. The social contestation around getting civil rights issues through the legislature got higher and higher into the 1960s. We relied on the courts. We've already talked about why that was not a great idea. And this became the dominant mode of liberal activism until the middle of the Obama administration. And I do want to point that out. And it is not that, despite the fact that Democrats have controlled the presidency a good deal of the 20th century, that is not why the Supreme Court was primarily liberal. In the past, it was harder to gauge the actual political alignment of justice. Period.
Shooter
End
is
of
a
discussion.
perfect example of this.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely more.
Sandra O'Connor's another one.
Another one.
Yeah.
Kennedy is another one. Where it's a complicated story because Kennedy retained kind of a libertarian bent when it came to economics, but also a genuine libertarian bent when it came to social issues. For example, he was the deciding factor in Obergefell v. Hodges. So that's true. It was harder to gauge the views of an individual justice who could shift over the course of their tenure and often wound up shifting to a more civil libertarian perspective as a result because of social change and alterations in the world around them. And then I think also it's worth mentioning that most of the really ambitious civil rights decisions came out of the Warren Court and immediately after a period of pretty strong Democratic control of the presidency, and was the result of a particularly activist court, which gradually became less activist, but still had this underlying bent, especially because of the recency of the precedents upholding liberal interpretations of what rights were guaranteed under the Constitution.
So I'm going to tell you another controversial opinion that I have. And this brings us to the Dobbs case, but now we're talking about law. I have always thought that Roe v. Wade, even as modified by Casey, frankly, the right it protected was worth protecting, but the legal grounds on which it protected it was frankly dumb.
I completely agree.
Like the idea of an implied right to privacy leading to an implied right to bodily autonomy off of gender discrimination, as opposed to just arguing for bodily autonomy, was kind of nutty as a way to get that law. Now, for many years, I would talk to like my liberal lawyer friends and even some left-wing lawyer friends, and they would quietly agree with me, but they would never say it out loud. Like, yeah, it won't be hard to really take apart Roe v. Wade because it's a weirdly argued law. And stare decisis on that's basically the only thing that's holding it together. For those of you who don't know what stare decisis is, it's just
it's precedent. There's in the Dobbs decision, their stare decisis analysis was awful. They said that there was no reliance interest on the decision because there was nobody currently at the moment that the decision was overturned really having an abortion. And so because you weren't going to immediately stop people mid-abortion, therefore there was no reliance interest, which is ludicrous, but does not fundamentally alter the thing you're talking about, which is that the decision was pretty poorly argued. And I would distinguish that from something like the gay marriage decision or Bostock, which extends discrimination protections to transgender and non-binary employees, which are premised on an equal protection argument. Basically, if it would be permitted for a man and a woman to marry each other, and then you're having two men or two women do it instead, that's sex discrimination, because if the genders were reversed on either party, it would be legal. So this is a much more straightforward argument, and it's one reason I think it's a stronger precedent and less likely to be struck down. Though, knowing this court, quite possible. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, this is one of the things I was going to ask you, though. I mean, it seems to me like we just don't know what this court's going to do, because we talked about the 4 Trump appointees, but I'll be particular. I do not know, outside of Amy Coney Barrett's decisions on abortion And I do not know, decide of Gorsuch's weird love of indigenous people, which I actually like, but it's completely out of the blue considered the rest of his jurisprudential decision making. How they are going to decide on this. Clearly, what we do know clearly is there is a tendency now in the Supreme Court to buy the unitary executive theory. Now, the unitary executive theory, we should be quite clear on, is a relatively new theory in the history of American politics.
It emerged during the Reagan administration, despite the fact that it's so dominant, only became huge during the Bush administration, the second Bush administration.
I was about to say, it's like, I remember, John, you arguing it and me going like, oh, this is a Reagan thing that's like picked up from stuff kind of sort of begun under Nixon, but neither Reagan nor Nixon pursued it that vigorously. And it has been consolidated under Trump. Although we can also say, for reasons of opportunism in many ways, the Democrats, while never endorsing the unitary executive theory, didn't do much about it either because, well, they liked having the power in the presidency when the Congress can't do shit. Anyway. But when we add all this together, I do think we have a perfect storm for a constitutional crisis. And the three things we talked about, and there's way more. I mean, Doge seems to be on its face transparently unconstitutional. It's about empowerment with people who are
not civil officers.
Who are not civil officers. Yeah.
Like,
what I mean, they're political appointees, basically, right?
They're political appointees, which means that there's a host of constraints on their powers. You know, there's a reason why cabinet officials have to go through the advice and consent feature of the Senate. And this current Senate might be willing to permit the appointment of a bunch of patently unqualified people. See Pete Hegseth, maybe RFK, maybe Tulsi Gabbard, we'll see. But I would be willing to bet that were Elon Musk an actual appointee rather than just a guy who Trump said, do your thing, it would be more difficult for him to complete an appointment process and be confirmed by the Senate, especially after what he's been doing for the past couple of weeks. You know, in terms of the rifling through of Treasury documents, looking at people's information, eliminating any protections for information the government has on you, stopping payments from occurring, taking over the Treasury's software. All of these things are not something an ordinary political appointee is allowed to do. This is something Treasury Department officials are permitted to do because they've gone through the advice and consent feature and have duly, been given the authority to handle these sensitive arenas of the infrastructure of the U.S. government. And as a result, so much of what Elon Musk has done thus far has been immediately subject to injunction by the courts. Now, will the executive branch listen to it is an open question, despite the fact that historically the executive branch since 1865 has always listened to the judicial branch. They've slow-walked things. They've not done a very good job of listening sometimes, but they've never blatantly ignored an order from the judiciary to do something. And that could be changing, and that is a genuine constitutional crisis moment, because, you know, Elon is not allowed to do most of what he's up to under the rules of the game that the people agreed to.
I hate to spell out what this would mean. If the executive ignores the courts, then the adjudicator is a group under the executive, but that does not take a vow, an oath to the executive. They take an oath to the Constitution. And if you catch what I'm saying, it means that the military is the adjudicator here. Because they're the people that can decide, well, the president's the commander in chief, but our oath is not to the president, the oath is to the Constitution.
the way in which injunctions occur typically, and this is relevant,
Mm-hmm.
is it is not a generalized order. It's an order to a specific official to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an open question. What would happen if the Supreme Court decided that the only mechanism for getting their actions to actively be done is to issue a writ of mandamus to the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? Right there, there's an opportunity for military clash with the remainder of the executive branch that we have never seen, which is very, very
Right.
frightening.
I mean, for those of you who don't get what that means, it means junta. I mean, you and I were talking about this off air, but I was like, what that basically implies is the republic is over either way. Even if you have a restored democracy, we've now done what a lot of Latin American countries have had to do, but we've had
Turkey,
a temporary military, Turkey. But we basically have a military government, returning power to the people, in quotation marks, or maybe not. I mean, we just don't know.
Yeah, I'm not under the impression that if there was military involvement in civilian affairs, I personally don't think it would be a permanent thing in the American context, though I don't want to find out
No.
either. And I do think that there are ways around constitutional crisis, but they're dependent on other officials in the executive branch undertaking actions in line with what the courts are ordering them to do, which opens the opportunity for more firings, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a real problem. That's something that historically could be counted on, but maybe not anymore.
And the other way you address it is to impeach the president, but this president's already been impeached twice, have impeachment articles brought against him twice. It is unlikely, I think, that it would work a third time,
certainly not with a Republican Congress.
Unless you have enough Republicans, they would never bring it. But unless you had enough Republicans get afraid that this legacy would tarnish their possibility of ever being in office again, that they would go against the president, which is what happened with Nixon, frankly.
Yeah. And it's less likely to happen now because Fox News didn't exist then, and it does now.
Right.
One thing I will say to take heart, listeners, is that under the federal system, elections are not conducted at the national level. They're conducted at the state level. And so it is inconceivable to think that something like an actual halt to elections could ever take place under the current structure of American governance, because each state is administering its own elections.
You may have actually given me one thing to feel decent about the states having control over elections, because normally I'm like, that's a terrible idea. But
there are limitations. The states are not allowed to prohibit people from voting because they're Black, because of the constitutional structure. But the federal government also is not allowed to administer elections. I always thought this was kind of foolish, but now I'm glad that that's the law.
Now, for those of you who go, well, Varn and Elijah, and particularly, we know that Varn and Elijah do not necessarily agree on the Democrats here. And I also want to share, as I said earlier, I am not necessarily a Constitution worshiper. I'm not one of these Constitution leftists who thinks that the Constitution is actually the best thing on the planet. But I am sort of the idea that something is revolutionary just because it breaks rule of law is an idiotic idea. And I've seen a lot of people flirting with that. I also want to point out that the Democrats lost, in my opinion, for a bunch of complicated reasons. But most of the reasons that the Democrats lost on margin are not things that would lead to Trump being popular for what he is doing right now.
Yeah. Price of eggs is at an all-time high.
I mean, I hate to tell you guys, some of the stuff that it ensures Trump may be unpopular are things that are gonna suck, but unfortunately are totally legal. For that are the deportations. Most of them are legal, peeps. Hate to tell you, but they are.
Yeah. I'm not certain about the Guantanamo Bay thing, but deporting people is completely legal.
And
the tariffs are completely legal, even though they actively go against the main demand that the American people had in this election, which was to lower the inflation rate. There are things that the president is doing which are totally legal, even if I think many of them are immoral or at the very least bad policy.
He can invade Panama under the Police Powers Act, and actually it would be totally legal, at least for a certain number of days.
Not invade Greenland, though.
No, because of NATO.
Because of NATO.
Yeah, NATO treaties. But Panama would be legal.
Yeah, highly unlikely he could get authorization to turn Gaza into a beach resort also. Though, we'll say that anybody who ever thought Trump would be better on the Palestinian issue, completely delusional, though I totally respect choosing not to vote for the Democrats last time around because of your feelings on that issue. That's your right. I just want to make sure to establish, if you're going on a lesser of two evils calculus, we are at evil o'clock. Nevertheless, I think I'm not Constitution worshiping, even though I study it. I think there's a lot of problems with the document. I do think that probably I would rather have it than nothing. And I would certainly rather have it than whatever Donald Trump would turn it into.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think we're going to learn really quickly is that while this blitz is a Bannon strategy, the content of this blitz isn't even what Bannon signed up for. The justification I've been hearing from both leftists who are more willing to be accommodationist or even supporting of Trump, and also certain conservatives, was that we were going to a post-neoliberal era, and that a right-wing populist ethos will remain. I'm sorry, but what I'm seeing is neoliberalism on crack. We're seeing
replacing everybody in the government with private contractors with stupid names.
Right. With no oversight. They're not even congressionally appointed contractors. It seems like Elon Musk has gotten Trump on board with Argentina's Malay as much as with any European populist, which in our country, as also the global hegemon, would be disastrous. Now, we're not going to stay the global hegemon. We're already in a multipolar world, blah, blah, blah. But I also want to point out that this will not help anybody, including America's enemies. It could actually collapse everyone's economy. So it's a very, although, I do find it funny because I have some friends who make jokes about how China prayed for a gift from God for America and it gave us Donald Trump. To completely
destroy any semblance of American power abroad.
Well, I mean, and let's think about the things, and I want to emphasize what I'm talking about now is completely legal, but having Biden normalize your tariff and reshoring regimes away from China with Canada and Mexico, and then threatening them with tariffs, the likes of which we had not seen since the Great Depression, to two states that have been utterly cooperative, and that every third day there's a new deal where Trump okay, we come up, we're going to stall the tariffs down for 30 days, except for this new tariff I came up with tomorrow that we're now going to apply, even though I've already said that we weren't going to do that.
I mean, a good example of this is that one of Trump's first things was to tariff Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing, while also impounding the CHIPS Act. This is not benefiting anyone. You know, it's just making it so that it's impossible to build computers anywhere. And computers need to be built. Like, that's just the way it is.
And particularly since Trump is also now doubling down, moving away from his prior basis on Sunbelt production, which has been the conservative basis since Reagan, at least, and focusing on his new friends in Silicon Valley, who were his direst enemies but 4 years ago. Impounding all the ability to build chips while also talking about having an AI economy is nuts. I mean,
it's just stupid. It's like,
I mean,
anybody who's a Trump accommodationist or supporter on the left is very, very stupid. I'm just going to say it. Like, unless you're like, I want to see America collapse as quickly as possible, which is also stupid because it's not going to be replaced by anything you like. There is absolutely nothing good which should come out of this.
And I think that's where I'm at right now too, because as much as I hate the Democrats, and I actually do think we should blame them for Trump being in office, we can't blame him for what Trump is doing in office. I am going to ask you, however, Elijah, why are they so fucking flat-footed right now? They're flat-footed in a way that I was not expecting. And I don't mean in the spectacular way we saw during the Trump administration, where they called for rallies and this, that, and the other, but clearly was like meaningless political engagement. Now we have Hakeem Jeffries trying to go and be like, pre-Silicon Valley, we still love you. Also say, yeah, go ahead.
I have no idea. I mean, I think the only thing the Democrats have been doing right is that many of the state's attorneys general have been initiating lawsuits, which is basically all you can do. But that's not really a vision. That's playing defense.
And it's from the states. It's governors and stuff and they've been asking these geriatric. Because let's make it very clear. Because of how narrow the control of the House and Senate are, to get an appropriations bill for Trump or anything like that, they are going to need Democrats. And so far, the Democrats have provided them, even though we are already in a constitutional crisis. I've been sort of like, wow. So, I mean, I will say that one of the things I've been thinking about is Trump's. I know you hear people worried about he's going to declare himself dictator. He's ancient. I know if he lived as long as his parents, he'll live longer than his term, but I don't see him living 2 terms.
Yeah. I mean, he's like one of the least healthy men I've ever seen, other than Joe Biden.
And he also seems to be out of energy. I mean, I was thinking about this. Trump, first administration, Trump wouldn't tolerate Elon showboating him the way that Elon currently is.
No, he'd get angry.
I actually don't know why he thinks this is going to go okay, because I do think that this is going to, what Elon is doing is going to break out an internal conservative Cold War, even within Trumpists. So you're no longer dealing with just
it already has on the H-1B stuff.
Right. Well,
but
one of the things I told a friend of mine, I want to be afraid about this. We always think the Blitz is just for his enemies, but I also think the Blitz may be for his base, because we're already seeing that some of the controversies are interesting, like this new Department of Religion, which I don't know how the fuck that's legal, but that he's trying to start. He appointed a spiritual advisor that is controversial even amongst conservative evangelical Christians.
You should appoint Rabbi Shmuley.
That
was a joke, audience. I don't like Rabbi Shmuley. Okay, continue.
But you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so I have seen rumblings in the conservative newsosphere about that, interestingly enough. And I do think the libertarians are going to have some issues because it's pretty clear that free speech is also going to be a lot more difficult under this regime. Do you agree with me with that? I know that like a lot of people are like, oh, well, the Democrats did backdoor pressure on the tech executives to do unconstitutional censoring, and guess what? I'll grant I think some of that was both done and illegal.
Yeah, and now if you're at all connected to the federal government in any way and you say anything, you get fired. That's a pretty strong constraint on free speech. In addition to the harassment of people by the Department of Justice, or Trump's promise to deport pro-Palestinian protesters. These are all very, very strong threats to free speech, and are completely unconstitutional.
So, why is it that anyone would argue that Trump is going to save the Constitution?
Because they don't have any understanding of the Constitution, or Trump, or both.
Because I mean, I do like it when we see like conservatives who used to be regular normie neoconservatives now signing a Vola and Carl Schmitt. So, and that way I'm like, well, you finally took the mask off, motherfucker. like we don't have to pretend anymore.
It sucks that for the liberals, if you take the mask off, it's just like a signed copy of Harry Potter rather than like Lenin.
Yeah, I know. I'm always listening to conservatives rail about how all the liberals are secret Marxist, and I'm like, if they were, you would have been shot already. Like, so it's just it. And no, I don't advocate killing conservatives, but I find it crazy that the world we're in right now. At the same time, I think the thing that concerns me, Elijah, and I want maybe this is a way to wrap up because we've kind of said the big three things. If we went through every executive order, we'd be here for 2 days.
Yeah.
I suspect with you that the courts are going to, because Trump's not going to have time to stack it in time, and he doesn't seem interested in that. The Supreme Court's going to side on precedent on birthright citizenship. They're probably going to decide on precedent with impoundment, with maybe some weird caveat carved out for Trump, but not to the extent that he's currently doing it. I also am not optimistic with you that these protections for hires in the executive branches are going to stay, because we do know that a lot of the jurisprudence of all of the current conservative justices is about weakening the administrative state explicitly.
Though it's also possible that they stay in a modified form. I don't know.
Well, I mean, we do know that Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett like to split the baby.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows? Doge, I have no idea how that's going to work out, because it's so clear, it's so blatantly unconstitutional. I can't, and it's a threat. It's a threat to the power of everybody else beyond this one administration. That's what I think people like. Unless the GOP Congress is totally just like, we want to rule once and then never have to worry about anything ever again, including having jobs in Congress. I don't think we're there yet. But if nothing is done about Doge, then I think we are now in the formal imperial. I mean, we've already been an empire, but I mean in the internal sense of imperial.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we basically have a true imperial presidency and a Bonapartist presidency. And
really humiliating, instead of us getting Napoleon or Caesar, to have Donald Trump and Elon Musk. That is an embarrassment, the legacy of Caesarism.
Even our strongmen are pudgy losers. who just happen to have played the government long enough to get very, very rich. In both cases, actually. I mean, the irony of Elon Musk wanting a balanced budget at the federal government level is that his entire career is impossible under those conditions. And in some ways, what he's trying to do is protect his own hegemony from anyone ever using the government to get back to where he was at. And if there's ever been any truth to an otherwise crazy idea like techno-neo-feudalism, that, if it does happen, would be that. So, you know, it's interesting. But I also can't see all the other branches lying down forever. But if they are, then I think the question for all of us is, our elites are that incompetent? Holy shit. Like that's where I'm at. I mean, that's actually what scares me more in Trump, is not just I expect Trump to try to get away with whatever he can try to get away with. And I do not expect Trump to be remotely consistent ideologically. In fact, a lot of what we see is reptile brain intelligence and believing in nothing. But it does seem like his reptile brain intelligence is reaching a limit, because none of the stuff he's doing is generally popular with the American public, who are not diehard Trumpist. And even the diehard Trumpists are only happy about it because he's doing it. They wouldn't be happy about it under other auspices. So, but like this picture of right populism that we were getting with Bannon and all that, that's not what Elon's doing. I mean, but I was reading like what Trump wants to do. Like he wants to increase the labor supply. How? How do you increase the labor supply and crack down on
and deport 20 million people?
And deport 20 million people, which admittedly also is, I want to point out, I realize it's fucked up that liberals are arguing that like basically we need borderline slave labor to make our economy affordable, because they have been crypto arguing that this entire time. But I mean, how do you do that? You just start arresting all the Zoomers and making them go to work camps? Because that's about the only thing I can think of. What are you going to do? Corvée labor? Which, by the way, would be unconstitutional under the 13th and 14th Amendment. Unless you arrested everybody, which would not shrink the federal budget. So,
yeah, I mean, it turns out that like almost none of these things work together or make any sense.
Well, that was my, like I said in the beginning, I was like, no one is dumb enough to try to do these contradictory things. And I should never say that. I should never say no one is dumb enough not to do contradictory things.
Look, I made the case for Project 2025 being bad before the last election season. And unfortunately been totally vindicated.
Yes, you have. By
just like assuming that the Trump people are very stupid. I'm never going to underestimate their intelligence ever again, or overestimate it. Or I don't know which it is, that not very intelligent.
Well, I mean, here's the point. Here's the thing about Trump world. I think Bannon's a genius. I don't admire him, but I think he's a genius. Elon, I don't get. Except for kicking the ladder out from everybody so he can benefit from the government contracts he got that made him rich, and now making that impossible for anyone else ever to get. Which I did sort of predict that Silicon Valley would do that eventually. But I wasn't expecting it like this. I wasn't expecting them to be like, we're not just going to destroy that. We're going to even go after stuff Trump has said he would never touch and has sincerely believed in the past. Like, we're watching
hate it when your Medicaid payments are not being dispersed, like that. Yeah. That was one reason Trump was so popular, is that he said he wouldn't touch that stuff.
Right. And we now see them pick back up privatizing Medicaid and Medicare, and even people like Robert Kennedy Jr., RFK, who used to be pro single payer, even, is now like, we should privatize Medicaid. These fuckers don't believe in a goddamn thing. And if you think you can follow them up because they just undo the liberal order, I mean, you might as well be saying after Trump us. because it's going to go the same way. And I'm not one for F-word analogies because I don't actually think Trump is a fascist, but like it's irrelevant at this point. And people are like, oh, what? It might not matter. In fact, fuck, MAGA may end up being worse than fascism. I don't know.
Either way, it's bad. That's what I'm willing to say.
Yeah, I mean, like we can have the semantic debates about the F word all you want. I don't really care about that. What I'm more interested in is what are we going to do now? Because the liberals seem to have rolled over. I mean, it really does seem to me, and you can tell me because you are friendlier to Democrats than I am. You always like remind me not to, start calling for their heads on platters and stuff.
I'm very disappointed in them. I mean,
I know you are. You seem more disappointed. You seem more disappointed. I've been in shock. I've been in thorough shock since Biden's debate. Because I'm just like, you guys have said that all democracy was on the line, and clearly you didn't actually believe it. And now it looks like it really is. You have Congress shut out of things that Congress can't be shut out of legally, but who knows how we're going to deal with that. I mean, as much as I hated the 3 years during the Biden administration of all the talk of fucking idiotic talk of civil war. Now I'm like, it's not likely, but it's not impossible now. It's you're getting into a very precarious situation, and the left has no real answer to it because all that the left has been talking about is either foreign policy, important. I'm not saying it's not. Absolutely important. Or has been just trying to tail one of the two parties, mostly the Democrats. But we saw this strange thing happening in the second half of the Trump administration. Really, we saw it as early as Biden winning. The leftists thought that they could get anti-systemic energy by playing some games around maybe or maybe not endorsing Trump. But now that Trump's in power, I want my leftist friends who thought that was a smart way to go about things to think about it. You're going to own what he breaks. Whether you truly endorse him or not, if you're seen to endorse him, that's on you too.
And this is distinct from people who are unfairly blamed for that. I know you agree with that. That there's a difference between, being
Jill Stein is not a Trump supporter.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. But there are definitely leftists who have the after Trump us attitude.
Right.
Now's your time to shine. To those guys.
I'm gonna just go ahead and say it outright. I didn't vote for Kamala Harris. I voted for some weird third party candidate. I actually voted for what's her face from the PSL, and I don't even like that party. I just it was a protest vote. And I don't regret it still, because also my state, Trump still won my state. My decision had nothing to do with what was going to happen here. But I am sort of shocked because on one hand, I want to say all my leftist friends have been disgusted at the Democrats. Well, guess what? In my mind, you were right to be disgusted because this is what they should have been there for. And they can't even do what they've traditionally done and like bullshit this. But if you think somehow that this is going to be good for the Constitution or for world peace, or that like one of the things I pointed out to people, I'm like, dude, if Greenland happened, NATO's over. Like, NATO's done. That would end NATO. In fact, you would only even consider that if you thought NATO was about to be over anyway.
Or you were too stupid to think about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is, I try to not assume. But my thing is with Trump is both brilliant and dumb simultaneously, and that's the hardest thing to fight. Because I think we all have to admit, he does have a reptile brain way about speaking to people that has gotten him through a whole lot. And the Democrats playing lawfare with him, which they did do, whether it was legitimate or not, they didn't play it very seriously because basically he was able to wait out the
Certainly
clock
not
without
very
even trying to.
Yeah.
I mean, and now between the Supreme Court and him being president, good luck on any of that happening, because by the time he's out of office, I mean, barring some really bad other options, the statute of limitations on most of the things that were brought up will be over. So I think the Democrats have been both craven and weak, but I am sort of like, what do we do now? Because like the other thing I'll tell you is, even if somehow Trump manages to maintain the next 4 years without dividing his own base, which we're already seeing break apart, I think, where he's hemorrhaging popularity already. I mean, he came in fairly unpopular, but he's dropped 4% popularity within 2 weeks. Like, he went from 51 to 47. And that's on the most friendly polls. And so it's just like a lot of people are already regretting their vote. And you're right, since it's a state level issue, we'll see very quickly how that plays out in the midterms. But I'm also sort of like, it's going to be bad for the Democrats too, unless they start pulling in new power and like really going after their gerontocracy out of New York and California. As far as the left goes, I have no idea what we should be doing except for labor stuff. The one thing I will tell you, that people who tried to tell you this stuff was going to get better for labor under Trump are full of shit. Like we're already seeing in my state, we've already seen an assault on collective bargaining for the few parts of the public sector that have it.
DOGE is an assault on collective bargaining at the federal level. The firing of the NLRB board member is an assault on collective bargaining at the federal level. This is a disastrous administration for labor already, and it's only getting worse.
Right. I mean, we're talking worse than the Bush and Reagan administrations, which is kind of hard to be. And so, and we're also seeing, I don't know, I have said stuff like, well, they've been promising the Department of Education forever, and they've never been able to do it. But I think they might try, even without congressional.
They'll do what they are doing right now to USAID.
Right. Now it'll be chaos. It's already chaos. A lot of a lot of the Biden schemes have been chaos, but it's going to be utter chaos. And I think for a lot of people, we don't know where we're going to be in 4 years. And I think for me, one of the reasons why I've been less likely to do punditry is I've seen pundits, they seem to be particularly given to becoming captive by their audiences and eventually just believing what their audiences want you to believe. Like me hearing from someone like Jimmy Dore that DOGE is a legitimate audit of the federal government. I'm like, only if we all knew what was happening and it was authorized and had proper powers to do it.
DOGE falls under the Presidential Records Act, which means that they don't have to give any records until 2035.
Right. So even we won't know.
It's completely in the dark. It's in the dark. We have no idea what's going on.
They could lie to us right now. We wouldn't know. So we see these pundits like saying things that are just tacitly idiotic. I've also learned, and I'm not one to say we need more civics education because I'm a teacher. I actually don't think education always works for that. But civilly right now, a lot of people, and including a lot of people in liberals or the left, have no idea what the law really is, and so they're talking out of their ass half the time. Like, people saying, I'm going to stand up for the Constitution, but, well, the oversight of administrative agencies is obviously in the executive, so it must be the president. I'm like, not with impoundment or safes created by Congress. It's not. There's both legislation about that after Nixon tried to do impoundment, and there's a Supreme Court precedent before that. Although I'll admit, we didn't talk about this, but actually the legislation made to make impoundment steadier actually might end up being something that helps make it seem like it might have some constitutional grounds, which is why I think we might see a a weird splitting of the baby there. I can't see them totally justifying the Trump impoundments. Like, but
We'll see. Yeah,
we'll see. We don't really know what this Supreme Court's going to do. But one thing I will tell you, Supreme Courts don't tend to give up their power. And a lot of what Trump is doing would even cause the courts to give up their power.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting. So yeah. Any last thoughts, Elijah?
It's very bad. We have, as a human species, been through tough times before. Humanity will survive. We'll see what happens on the other side. Yeah, probably will survive. We'll see what happens on the other side, and somebody should figure out something to do. Because counting on lawyers seems to be the plan right now. And while I very much appreciate the faith placed in the profession I'm going into, not a panacea.
I don't want to sound like one of those freaky liberals who was talking about civil war in 2020, but I do want to point out the last time we've seen this kind of dysfunction was between 1840 and 1860. And we solved that, but
it's going to be terrible when we go to war over whether or not Elon Musk is funny.
I mean, it's I believe in free speech, but I also may be at the point where I think social media should be outlawed. So
well, unfortunately, that is another illegal thing Donald Trump is doing, keeping TikTok alive beyond its congressionally authorized date of divestiture or ban.
Although he did seem to have a buyer set up for it somehow. I'm trying to figure out how that worked. That seemed like it was like pre-decided some way. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. I don't expect the Republican Congress to grow any balls outside of Rand Paul complaining about stuff. And who knew that I'd be pro team Rand Paul, the world's last fucking libertarian.
You hate it when it's bad news that Mitch McConnell is falling down the stairs.
Yeah, man. One thing I've learned about America is however dark you think it already is, it can get darker. God
bless.
God bless. And on that note, we're going to end. Have a great rest of your days, friends of the show. And be very, very mad at a bunch of people, most especially, my partner got on me. He's like, you always harp about being mad at the liberals, but don't you have to be mad at the people doing this? I'm like, well, be mad at them first, actually, yes. But also be mad at the liberals who put us in this situation in the first place. And
be mad at everyone doing bad things.
Yes, which is unfortunately most of the government. So on that note, we will end. Have a good day. Bye-bye.